Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 2022 HIC and Sheltered PIT Training. Please enter your agency name into the chat box so we know who is participating. During the training, if you have questions, feel free to enter them into the chat box, or you can also unmute yourself to ask your question. And we are going to get started. So our agenda for today is to provide an overview of the HIC and Sheltered PIT and then get into the data collection for the HIC and Sheltered PIT. Then we will be going over the timeline and submission process, and then we will end the training with any Q&A that the group has. So what is the HIC and Sheltered PIT? The HIC and Sheltered PIT are usually conducted on the last 10 nights of January. But due to the COVID pandemic and the Omicron surge, our COC has rescheduled the PIT and HIC to occur in February, which is next week on February 21st. So the HIC is a housing inventory chart, and it includes housing projects that target homeless clients in Orange County. This is emergency shelter, transitional housing, rapid rehousing, permanent supportive housing, and other permanent housing. And then for the Sheltered PIT, it includes emergency shelter and transitional housing projects. There is also an unsheltered point in time count. There's a link in the slides if you're interested in participating in that. That is counting clients that are literally homeless on the streets during the night of the count. So if you're interested in that as well, the link is available there. But the focus of the training today will be on the HIC and the Sheltered PIT. So I'm going to start with the HIC first, because that applies to all agencies with homeless housing projects. And then we will get into the point in time as well. So each agency that will be submitting the HIC will have to submit this form. And the HIC is for agencies participating in HMIS as well as those that do not. So I'll show you a sample of what the form looks like in a minute, but it's an Excel document. Each project is a separate row. And then also, if the project has both current and under development beds, which I'll talk about a little bit more, that would also be an additional row. You'll also see on the next slide, there are yellow cells on the Excel spreadsheet that have comments to provide more details on what the question is asking. And then there are auto-calculated cells on the spreadsheet that are gray, and then there's also a glossary tab with more details. So this is a sample of what the HIC answer form looks like. It's very long and couldn't all be included on this slide, but you can see each column is a separate field that needs to be answered for each project. And if you hover over cells, you can see a description of what the field is collecting and how it should be answered. Like I mentioned before, there's also a glossary tab with more information on what some of these fields mean. But the HIC answer form has a lot of the details that you're looking for. If you need to come back later and aren't sure how to collect something, the HIC answer form is the first place to look to answer those questions. And then, so like I mentioned, each project here would be a separate row. And then if your project has both current and under development beds, which is a question on this form also, you would need a separate row for each of those inventory types. And under development just means the beds are coming online at some point, but weren't available during the HIC and PIT. So for the training, I'm going to focus on the fields for the HIC that we usually have the most questions about. There are some additional fields, but they are pretty self-explanatory, or at least most people don't have questions about those fields. So the first few questions on the form are in regards to the project location. Each project should only report one location on the HIC, and this location should reflect where the majority of beds are located. And so zip code and geocode must match for all projects in order for us to be able to submit the HIC. And so if you have a tenant-based project and you have beds across the county with no set location, you can just enter the zip and geocode where most of your beds are located. And also those providers that are DB providers should only enter the geocode and zip code, not the physical address of their project. Questions 14 through 23 on the inventory are about the bed inventory, which is kind of the meat of the HIC. This section is broken down by household type. So there will be a section for households without children, households with children and adults, and households with only children. And for each of those household types, you will have to enter the inventory start and end date, as well as the beds and units available for that household type. The inventory start date reflects the first date that the beds became available for that household type. So if you're reporting a change from the previous year, it would be the first date those beds became available. Or if your project has maintained the same inventory since it first started, then maybe your inventory start date would match your project operating start date. In this section, cribs and overflow beds are not reported. There is a separate section for overflow beds. Cribs are not reported at all on the HIC. And just a general rule for all projects except for rapid rehousing projects, your beds and units should remain the same as the previous year unless your units and vouchers were added or removed from your project. So we're trying to maintain consistency with our bed counts, and so there shouldn't be a change unless like your program capacity has changed in some way. So I'm just going to pause for a second and see if any questions have come in so far. All right, I'm not seeing anything. So to go into a little bit more detail on the bed inventory, I've got a few slides on this. I'm starting with families. So those of you with family projects, especially emergency or transitional housing projects, you may have a fixed number of units, but your bed count can fluctuate depending on the size of the household. So for example, maybe you have a unit with a capacity of 5 beds, but it just depends. You're not going to put people from multiple households in one unit. So, you know, it really depends on the size of that household. In that case, you can report the number of units that you have for your household type. And then for the beds, you would want to use your average family size for clients in that project. And the reason for that is to reflect how the units are typically utilized in your project. You don't necessarily want to report the max capacity in this case, because if your average family size is smaller, then you will look underutilized all the time, which isn't what we want either. So we do have a knowledge-based article on average family size. And if your agency is participating in HMIS, we have a report that you can run to determine your average family size. So you can look at that knowledge-based article for more details on that. The next special circumstance for bed inventory is for voucher projects, in particular permanent housing voucher projects. So in these cases, the project will have a set number of vouchers, say 20 or 30 vouchers, and your goal is to utilize those vouchers, whatever the household size may be. So for the purposes of the HIC, we want to reflect the number of beds that are, or number of bedrooms that are in each unit, and that will help us standardize the bed inventory for voucher projects. So for each voucher that you have, there'll be a corresponding unit. And so you want to look at that unit, determine how many bedrooms are in it, and then that will help you determine your bed count. So if you have a unit with either 0 bedrooms, so it's a studio, or 1 bedroom, you would reflect that unit under households without children, and that would be 1 bed. And then if you have a unit with 2 bedrooms or 3 bedrooms, you would reflect those under households with children and adults. And for 2 bedrooms, you would report 3 beds. And for 3 bedrooms, you would report 5 beds. And so again, this process is to help standardize the bed inventory across projects. And the numbers of beds were determined based on how units of these size have typically been utilized in the past. The next special case are tenant-based permanent housing and rapid rehousing projects. In this case, your bed inventory should reflect the clients active in your project and placed in a permanent housing unit on the night of the count. So to determine your beds, it would be the number of clients by household type, and then units would be the number of families in households with children and adults. If your project is participating in HMIS, we do have a report you can run to pull that data. I'll go over this report a little bit more in a minute, but it's called the Count of Persons by Household Type report. So you would run that. If you are a domestic violence provider, your data obviously is not an HMIS, so you'll need to determine the number of active clients in the project that are in permanent housing on that night. Next up, we have SSVF emergency housing assistance clients. So, oh, just a second, I got a question. Where do EHV programs fall, voucher program, or do we treat this as RRH? So there's 2 types of EHV projects. There's the actual voucher project, which would use the voucher methodology I mentioned before. There are also EHV supportive services projects, which are set up in HMIS as rapid rehousing. And so those would use the rapid rehousing methodology. And then, yes, so for the EHV supportive services projects that are set up as rapid rehousing, you would follow this methodology. So it's active clients in the project and in permanent housing on the night of the HIC and PIT. All right, just taking a second to see if any other questions come in. All right. And these slides will be published following this training if you want to go back and look at them in more detail as well. So for SSVF EHA clients, so these clients are in the SSVF project in HMIS, which is rapid rehousing. But as of the night of the HIC, these clients have not been placed in a housing unit. And in some cases, the SSVF provider may provide emergency housing assistance to these clients as a temporary solution while they wait for that permanent housing placement. So for the HIC, these clients are technically considered as emergency shelter clients. So in order to determine these numbers, you would look at active clients that are in your SSVF rapid rehousing project that have not been placed in permanent housing and are receiving emergency housing assistance on the night of the HIC and PIT. I know that's a lot of words, but never fear, we do have a report for that as well. And I'll go over that a little bit more in a second, what that report looks like, but there is a report that will pull these clients for you. On the HIC, you will have to report these clients as a separate row and a separate project for emergency shelter. And these clients are considered not participating in HMIS since they would need to have their own emergency project set up in order to be considered HMIS participating. So I will go over this report in a minute, but this is the guidelines for SSVF EHA clients. All right, so that's probably the hardest part of the training. So good job, everybody. The next few columns are for dedicated beds on the HIC. So these fields are optional, but they are meant to reflect if your project is dedicating any beds to certain population types. So in this case, it's chronically homeless beds, veteran beds, and youth beds. The chronically homeless beds can only be reported for permanent supportive housing projects. And if your project does have dedicated beds, it means that the bed must be filled by a client or one of their household members that meet the population, whatever that may be. Otherwise, it will remain empty until you find a client. So if you say you have 10 chronically homeless beds, every client in those beds has to be a chronically homeless client or one of their household members. So if you should not report dedicated beds if you will take veterans or youth or chronically homeless. It's only if you are required to take those populations. And also, these beds are reported by household type as well. And the number of beds that you report, of dedicated beds that you report for each household type has to be less than or equal to whatever you reported in the bed inventory section for your household types. I got a question about age range for youth. Youth is that everybody in the household has to be under the age of 25. All right, the next few questions are specific to rapid rehousing projects. This section is to report the max capacity for rapid rehousing. So as I mentioned earlier, in the bed inventory section, you're only reporting clients that are active in your project and in permanent housing. This is now asking for your max capacity for rapid rehousing. So how many clients and households can your project serve on one night? If your project has a contract and that contract says you will serve 50 households and 100 clients or whatever the case may be, that's your max capacity. And so that's what you would report here. If you do not have a contract that has that information, what you will want to do is run a report. If you're an HMIS, we have a report. If you're not an HMIS, you'll have to determine manually when during the last year you had the highest number of clients active in your project on a single night. And then that number is used as your max capacity. So when in the last year you had the most clients. So for HMIS projects, we have a report that will show you the number of active enrollments in a given week This is a sample of what it will look like. I recommend including a program filter, so you can see one program at a time, but you can run it for all programs at one time. It's just a little bit easier to do it by project. So when you pull a report, it is automatically sorting your enrollments to show you which weeks you had the most active enrollments. And so you can see that there's multiple weeks here where I had 24 active enrollments during the week. So this report is kind of used to help narrow down when you had the most active clients. When you have that information, so you can run the count of clients report that I'm going to show you in a minute for any day during this week, for example, the week of 12/27. You can run that other report for that day, and that'll tell you how many clients you had active on that specific date. And you can use that for your max capacity. I got another question. What if the contract only includes households, not individuals? So if that is the case, then the households, you would, if it's households with children, you would use that as your unit number. And then you can use that average family size report that I mentioned earlier to determine your beds. If your project is households without children and it's gives you, if your contract says max households, then the households would be your beds for households without children. I feel like I'm saying households so many times. All right. The next set of columns on the HIC Answer Form is for active clients. So again, you have to report the number of active clients in each household type. If your project is an emergency shelter or transitional housing project, these numbers must match the PIT data that you're also going to submit, which we'll be going over in a minute. If you have a rapid rehousing, permanent supportive housing, or other permanent housing project, then these clients should include active clients in the project and placed in a housing unit. And so in the case of rapid rehousing, columns 51 to 54, which is active clients, will be the same as the beds you reported under the bed inventory section. So again, if you are an HMIS participating project, we have some reports for you to help make this a little bit easier. All reports that I mentioned here are located under the HIC and PIT section on the data analysis page in HMIS. The first set of reports, we have the count of persons by household type. This is an aggregate report, and you can use this data to report directly into your HIC Answer Form. Sorry, just a second. Okay, so the count of persons by household type report is an aggregate report, and you can report these data or these different data points into the HIC Answer Form for your bed inventory. There are two separate versions of this report. One is for permanent housing projects, and one is for emergency or transitional housing projects. And then we also have a details report version of these. So you can see a list of the clients that are being included on each of these reports. If any of these numbers don't look correct, you can look at the details report to figure out what's going on. So I'm going to show you those in a minute, but I got a question for SSVF EHA. Are we counting those under ES? Yes. So The EHA clients, it will be considered a separate emergency shelter project. So it should have its own row on the report. And it would be considered not participating in HMIS. All right, so the first report, like I mentioned, is the count of persons by household type. And it is available in HMIS now. The only filter that you need to worry about on this report is the program full name filter. So make sure you update that. And then when the report runs, it will show you your aggregate data by household type. So this is active clients in households with at least one adult and one child, households without children and with only children. And there's also a count of the households with at least one adult and one child also. So you can plug these numbers into the active clients section of your HIC to reflect your active clients. And then for rapid rehousing, you can also use these same numbers for your bed inventory section. And then, as I mentioned, we also have a details version of this report. So if you pull the first report and say, this isn't right, this doesn't reflect the active clients in my project, you can run this report and it'll list all of the clients in your project and with the start and end dates here. And so you'll be able to review those and figure out if clients need to be added or removed or otherwise updated in HMIS to make this report accurate. And when you run this report, you can include the program name filter if you want. It may help with your review, but you don't have to. For the other report I just mentioned, the aggregate report, you do have to put in a program name. All right, so in order to streamline the HIC process, 211 OC will be sending each agency the HIC program inventory report. So this report includes all projects active at your agency that have program descriptor data in HMIS. So program descriptor data elements are like the agency name, program type, bed inventory information. So all of that is captured in HMIS, even for DV agencies. So we will be sending you this report in order to help you with your HIC data entry. So I'm going to show you in a second what this looks like. But again, each project is a row. Each household type is also a row, and I'll show you what that looks like. And this report should be used as a starting point for your HIC Answer Form. So ideally, you'll just be able to review the data that's on this report and transfer it over into your HIC Answer Form and submit. Although I know it's not always that easy, but that's the dream. So when you receive this report, it'll look something like this. And then you can see here are your project names as we have them in HMIS. And you can see here for Aaron's transitional housing, there are 2 rows. And the reason is because if you look in the household type column, there are 2 household types for this project. So this project has beds for households without children and also has beds for households with at least 1 adult and 1 child. So for a lot of these fields, you will be able to just kind of transfer the data over, like project name, project type, target population, the zip code and location information ideally will match, but it's possible if your project is as a change, you might have to update that. The section I wanted to talk about a little bit was the bed inventory stuff. So For each household type, all of this bed inventory information will look different depending on how many beds are allocated for that household type. So you'll see the bed and unit inventory here. And then the part I wanted to talk about a little bit was the dedicated beds section. So you can see on here that there are multiple chronically homeless columns, veteran and youth columns. So in order to determine your total chronically homeless bed count or youth bed count, you're going to want to sum the columns for those dedicated beds prior to entering them in the HIC. So for example, this transitional housing project has 75 beds for households without children. And then of those, 5 are for youth veterans and 10 are for other youth. So on the HIC Answer Form, you'll report your 75 beds for households without children. And then in the youth section, you will report 15 beds for households without children because you're summing these two. And then you will also report 5 beds for veterans in households without children. And so we hope this report will make your process a little bit easier. One of the reasons we want to do it this way this year is because it will also include new projects at your agency that maybe weren't included on the HIC last year. So we're hoping this will help the process, but we are looking forward to your feedback on it also to try to make this as easy for you as it can be. The other thing I wanted to mention about this report is we have a funding source column here. You only need to care about this column if you are receiving any of the federal funding listed on the HIC Answer Form. So that's COC, ESG, or YHDP, which our COC is not receiving. Or if you're receiving other federal funding like BASH, HOPWA, RI, SSVF, Home ARP, the emergency housing voucher funding. So if your funding source says local or other, you can just disregard it. But on the HIC Answer Form, it lists out the different funding sources for McKinney-Vento as well as other federal funding. So you only need to care about this column if the funding here shows up in that field. All right, I got another question. If the city is funding the program and they are using multiple sources, including ESG, do we still report it? Yes. So on the HIC Answer Form, we do have, let me pull it up really quick. We have a couple columns for funding sources so that you are able to report multiple types of funding. And because if you're getting ESG and COC funding, we want you to report both so that we're capturing all that information on the HIC Answer Form. So this is the HIC Answer Form. There are 2 columns here for HUD McKinney-Vento, and you can see from the drop down that's either COC, EHP, or ESG or YHDP. So if you're getting both COC and ESG, you would do 1 funding source in each column. And then same thing for the other federal funding sources. There's a drop down here. If you want to read the full thing, you can hover over it and get the full list. But if your project is receiving multiple sources, we want you to report both. If your project is not receiving any of these sources, then you can just leave these fields blank. All right. The next form is the HIC Client Form. So this form is only submitted by permanent housing projects that are not participating in HMIS. Again, each project in this case is a separate spreadsheet, and each row is a separate client. Like on our other forms, there are yellow cells with descriptions if you need more details on how to answer a column. And the first 3 rows on this are sample data, just so you can see how the data is being collected. But this report is showing client level data for clients in your permanent housing project. This data is not for submission to HUD or for publication or anything like that. The only reason we're collecting this data is so that we can verify that the data you are submitting on your HIC Answer Form is accurate. So like I said, this is only for permanent housing projects not participating in HMIS. If your agency is participating in HMIS, don't worry about this. We have access to pull the reports we need to verify your data. So this is just for those other projects. And the form is very similar to the PIT Answer Form that I'll be going over in a minute. But it's just like I said, so that we can verify your data. All right. I'm not seeing any questions, so I'm going to go into the PIT now. I'm going to start with the PIT Answer Form. This form is only for agencies not participating in HMIS. And this is only, again, for emergency shelter and transitional housing projects. After that, I will go into the PIT report, which is how the HMIS projects will be submitting your data. So on the PIT Answer Form, each project is a separate spreadsheet. Each row is a separate client. There are the yellow cells with descriptions again, and we do have some sample data in here also to help you with your data entry. So you'll see here, you'll put in your agency name and contact information, as well as the project name and type. And then each row, like I said, is a separate client. And this information should match the data that you're submitting for the HIC Answer Form. So for example, if you say you have 10 clients in households with children and 2 clients in households without children, then there should be 12 clients on this PIT Answer Form, and there should be 10 with children and 2 without. So most of the information on the PIT Answer Form is fairly straightforward. It's mostly demographic information like race, gender, ethnicity, different disability types, their veteran status, that kind of stuff. One section I wanted to touch on briefly is regarding household information. So for the purposes of the PIT, a household is one or more individuals who present themselves to your project together for services. And so on the PIT Answer Form, there's a section that asks about household information, and in particular, the household ID. You want to make sure everybody in the household has the same household ID. And in terms of how to create the household ID, we want to do it alphabetically. So start with A, go to B, and then each client in that household should have the same household ID. So you'll see here on the sample, we have a 31-year-old female and a 14-year-old male. They are both in household A. So these clients are in the same household together. So that's what we need you to do as you complete this form, and completing it in alphabetical order. All right, for projects, emergency shelter and transitional housing projects that participate in HMIS, we have reports for you. The type of reports that you need depends on the type of project that you have. So we have one report that's for entry, exit, and transitional housing projects, emergency shelter entry, exit. So in most cases, the emergency shelter projects are entry, exit, and that means that when a client comes to your project, they enroll on one date and then they stay in the project every night until whenever their exit date is. And that is how most emergency shelter projects function in Orange County. There are a couple cases of emergency shelter night by night projects. And this means that the clients will be enrolled one night and they will stay on and off throughout the enrollment. So they're not there consistently every night. They come occasionally, and when they do, the agency tracks a bed night for that client to reflect that they stayed in the project on that night. So there's a separate PIT report for those type of projects. I think it's only 1 or 2. There's also a separate PIT report for HOPWA short-term supportive housing projects. This report is located under your agency folder for those 2 projects. And then SSVF EHA projects, there is an SSVF EHA report. And so you will only run one of these for each of your projects, just depending on which of these 4 type of projects it is. And this is what the report looks like. And this is the report that your agency will be submitting for the PIT. So for your submission, you don't need to edit any of the filters on here. You can just leave it. It's already including all emergency and transitional housing projects at your agency that reflect whichever of these 4 reports that I mentioned. The report has already been filtered to limit to those results. So you don't need to adjust the filters at all. You just need to run the report and make sure the data looks right. So it's a client level report. So it'll have your agency and project name, some identifying information for the client, and demographic information. And this is used as your PIT submission. And all 4 of the reports I just mentioned look the same, except for a couple of the projects, the HOPWA funded projects, and potentially also the night by night. There will be a column at the end of the report to reflect which city the client was in on the night of the PIT. And for SSVF EHA projects, there's a column at the end that says, is this an EHA client, yes or no? And you will only need to filter for those that say yes, and that those you would submit for your PIT. I received a question, do you suggest we run these reports as CSVs? Yes, so all 4 of these projects that I mentioned for the PIT, you should all be run as CSVs and submitted as CSVs. If you submit it as a PDF, we're going to ask you to resend it. So just keep that in mind as well. All right, so we've shared this a couple times, but for those that haven't seen it, I wanted to share the timeline. The HIC and sheltered PIT will occur on the night of February 21st, which is next Monday. And then your agency will have until February 24th to complete your data entry into HMIS or your comparable database for all data through February 21st. The following day, 211 OC will send the HIC program inventory report that I mentioned to all agencies. And then we will also send the PIT data that I just showed you. We will send that to the agencies participating in HMIS. Once you receive that data, your job is to review what we submitted or sent you and correct your data as needed. So for the PIT, you would need to update HMIS to reflect any changes so that when you run the PIT report again, it looks the way that it should. And then for the HIC, you will complete data entry into the HIC Answer Form using that HIC program inventory report we sent. And then on March 4th, you will need to submit your final HIC Answer Form and your PIT report and/or PIT Answer Form. And then which is a Friday, the following Monday, 211 will start reviewing forms and working with the agencies as needed. We're hoping that will take until March 25th. It could go a little bit longer depending on how the review process goes, but that's the goal right now. Once we finish our work with the agencies and finalize all the data, we will do data entry into HMIS or HDX, sorry. That is the software that HUD requires us to use to submit the HIC and PIT data. So we will do data entry in there at the end of March or potentially early April, depending on the rest of the steps and how they go. And then once the data entry is completed, we will send that data to the agencies just to give you a chance to review and say, hey, is the data entry that we did correct? This is only for you to review data entry. At this point, we are no longer making changes if something has changed to your agency. It's just, does the data reflect what I submitted to 211? And then once you receive that email from us, you will have until April 6th, or this date could change a little bit depending on how things go, but we will let you know the due date to confirm that data that it's accurate. So in terms of what you need to submit, if your agency is participating in HMIS, you will need to submit the HIC Answer Form, and then you will need to submit the PIT report for your emergency and transitional housing projects. It should be one PIT report that includes all of these projects at your agency. If your agency or project is not participating in HMIS, you will need to submit the HIC Answer Form as well. And then you will need to submit the PIT Answer Form for your emergency and transitional housing projects. Remember that you submit a separate answer form for each project. And you will also need to submit the HIC Client Form for your permanent supportive housing, other permanent housing, and rapid rehousing projects. And again, it's a separate form for each project. To complete your submission, you will upload these documents to your agency's Dropbox. If you don't know how to access your Dropbox, this is a link with instructions on how to do that. You can also enter a ticket with the HMIS help desk if you need help for this or any other issues with the HIC and PIT process, and that link is here as well. All right, so that's most of the information I have. If you have questions, feel free to start putting them in the chat. But I included the different knowledge base articles that we have that will potentially help you through this process. Like I mentioned, we will publish these slides, so you'll be able to click on these links. But we have a knowledge base article with an overview of the HIC and sheltered PIT, as well as all of the forms, some the timeline, some FAQs. So this will give you a general overview, and this is also where the slides will be posted. We have separate articles on how to fill out the HIC Answer Form and the PIT Answer Form. These are more high level about how the form works, and use the yellow fields to get details on that column, that kind of stuff. If you're looking for more details on a specific field, it would be those yellow cells that I mentioned before, or you can also come back and review this training again, which is recorded and will be posted following the meeting as well. We also have an article on how to find the average family size for your project, which I mentioned earlier. Running a saved look, this is how you pull reports in Clarity. If you need a refresher, you can look at that. And then, like I mentioned, we have an article on how to access your agency's Dropbox folder. So if you need a refresher on that, you can use this link. And then, of course, our link to our HMIS help desk for any questions. So that is all the information I had to share. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat or go ahead and unmute yourself now. If you haven't already, please also enter your name into the agency or into the chat box. Sorry, I said that all wrong. Enter your agency name into the chat box so you know who's participating.
Hi, this is Adriana from Wise Place.
Hi there.
So I'm gonna play the new card because this is my first time doing the HIC and PIT myself. So I'm gonna have like 3 or 4 questions if that's okay with you.
Sure.
Okay, so if I'm understanding correctly, basically because we are an HMIS participating agency, I can pretty much pull all this information from the reports that you listed in the presentation is what I'm understanding, correct?
Yes.
Great. I wanted some clarification on the counting a unit size and a house. I think it was unit and household. I think it might have been like slide 2 that you were going over it. The difference between being able to count beds when it's a unit or a bed. I needed a little bit more clarification on that. Would you mind doing that again?
Sure. All right, so for your project.
Specifically rapid rehousing, thank you.
Okay, rapid rehousing. Okay, so for rapid rehousing projects, for rapid rehousing clients, projects, the clients in your project are going to translate to your beds. So in order for a client to be counted in the rapid rehousing project, they need to be active in your rapid rehousing project on the night of the HIC and PIT, and they also need to be in a permanent housing placement. So then once you know who those clients are, which you can find by running this report that's listed here, that will tell you who should be included, and then you assign those clients based on their household type. So if the clients are in households without children, then the number of beds for households without children should equal the number of clients. If the clients are in households with children and adults, again, the beds will equal the number of clients, and then the units will equal the number of families. So if you have 10 clients in 4 households in rapid rehousing for households with children and adults, then your bed count would be 10 and your units would be 4. So
the units are households basically.
Yeah, so when you run this report, the count of persons by household type, the households with at least 1 adult and 1 child, that's going to be your units. And then the persons in each household, those are your beds.
Okay. And then my last question that I needed help clarifying was the zip code geolocation part. So for example, with rapid rehousing, like you said, that they would be scattered, right? They'd be in multiple cities. So then we would just answer that question based on where our participants are most commonly housed, what city? Am I understanding that?
Yeah, so it will be the city where most of your clients are located on the night of the HIC and PIT. And so for tenant-based projects, you can just report the zip code and geocode for those clients. You don't have to put in a physical address, but if it is like an emergency shelter or transitional or other project-based beds, then you would report the full address.
So for the rapid rehousing participants, let's say I have them in 3 different cities, how would I gather the geocode? Would that be pulled also from HMIS?
So it would depend on your project and if you are collecting the city where they are housed. Many projects are not tracking that in HMIS, but you would just look at if you have like a spreadsheet or something where you're tracking what city they're in, it would just be which clients are in one city the most.
Okay, but the geo, so I can do that with zip code. I guess I'm having a
Oh, okay.
geocode. Yeah.
In the geocode column, there is a list and it has the cities and that translates to a number. So like Anaheim.
Thanks. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Sure. Other questions? I got a question. My agency is with the city of San Clemente. What is expected from the city with outreach as its only program? So if you are an outreach project, you would not participate in the HIC and sheltered pit, but if possible, you would participate in the unsheltered pit count, which is a count of clients that are literally homeless and on the streets. That's where you would potentially participate to make sure your clients are counted. And there is a link on one of the first slides to the unsheltered pit count page if you would like more information on that. It's Everyone Counts OC. Any other questions? All right, I'm not seeing any other questions coming in, so thank you all so much for attending. As I mentioned, the slides and the recording from this training will be published, and we'll send out an email to everyone when that's available. Thank you all so much again, and we look forward to working with you through this process. Have a great day, everyone.